So thanks for coming. Really, it's great to see people actually concerned with this issue. I'm an environmental studies major, so I hear the term fracking being used 3 to 4 times a day. But really, it's surprising how the majority of the population really has no idea what's going on. But what else is there to say here? Well, basically what's going on today is I'm going to show a brief video to get everybody on board with what fracking is, give you some of the basic issues, and then the debate team's going to take over. They'll debate for 25-30 minutes, and then we'll leave the room open for discussion at the end. So feel free to bring up questions and concerns. We're ready to go? Okay, can you turn off the lights for a second?
What is hydraulic fracturing, or fracking? Since the Industrial Revolution, our energy consumption has risen unceasingly. The majority of this energy consumption is supplied by fossil fuels like coal or natural gas. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about a controversial method of extracting natural gas, hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. Put simply, fracking describes the recovery of natural gas from deep layers inside the earth. In this method, porous rock is fractured by the use of water, sand and chemicals in order to release the enclosed natural gas. The technique of fracking has been known since the 1940s. Nonetheless, only in the last 10 years has there been quite a fracking boom, especially in the USA. This is because most conventional natural gas sources in America and on the European continent have been exhausted. Thus, prices for natural gas and other fuels are rising steadily. Significantly more complicated and expensive methods, like fracking, have now become attractive and profitable. In the meantime, fracking has already been used more than 1 million times in the USA alone. Over 60% of all new oil and gas wells are drilled by using fracking. Now, let's take a look at how fracking actually works. First, a shaft is drilled several hundred meters into the earth. From there, a horizontal hole is drilled into the gas-bearing layer of rock. Next, the fracking fluid is pumped into the ground using high-performance pumps. On average, the fluid consists of 8 million liters of water, which amounts to about the daily consumption of 65,000 people, plus several thousand tons of sand and about 200,000 liters of chemicals. The mixture penetrates into the rock layer and produces innumerable tiny cracks. The sand prevents the cracks from closing again. The chemicals perform various tasks. Among other things, they compress the water, kill off bacteria, or dissolve minerals. Next, the majority of the fracking fluid is pumped out again. And now the natural gas can be recovered. As soon as the gas source is exhausted, the drill hole is sealed. As a rule, the fracking fluid is pumped back into deep underground layers and sealed in there. However, fracking is also associated with several considerable risks. The primary risk consists in the contamination of drinking water sources. Fracking not only consumes large quantities of fresh water, but in addition the water is subsequently contaminated and is highly toxic. The contamination is so severe that the water cannot even be cleaned in a treatment plant. Even though the danger is known and theoretically could be managed, in the USA already, sources have been contaminated due to negligence. No one yet knows how the enclosed water will behave in the future, since there have not yet been any long-term studies on the subject. The chemicals used in fracking vary from the hazardous to the extremely toxic and carcinogenic, such as benzol or formic acid. The companies using fracking say nothing about the precise composition of the chemical mixture. But it is known that there are about 700 different chemical agents which can be used in the process. Another risk is the release of greenhouse gases. The natural gas recovered by fracking consists largely of methane, a greenhouse gas which is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Natural gas is less harmful than coal when burned, but nonetheless, the negative effects of fracking on the climate balance are overall greater. Firstly, the fracking process requires a very large consumption of energy. Secondly, the drill holes are quickly exhausted, and it's necessary to drill fracking holes much more frequently than for classical natural gas wells. In addition, about 3% of the recovered gas is lost in the extraction and escapes into the atmosphere. So how is fracking and its expected benefits to be assessed when the advantages are balanced against the disadvantages? When properly employed, this technique offers one way in the short to medium term to meet our demand for lower cost energy. But the long-term consequences of fracking are unforeseeable, and the risk to our drinking water thus should not be underestimated.
I know the debate team's going to take over. Just keep in mind that they're not necessarily, they're looking at this from a more objective point of view, so they're not necessarily taking the side of what they believe in. So don't like form an angry mob against the people you don't really trust. But do you want to, who's going to explain?
Yeah, I'll explain.
Okay.
Hello everyone, I'm Logan. Just a few things about the way that we're going to debate. The first thing is, anything that I said is not necessarily a belief of the debater. So some of us are going to defend fracking and some of us are going to go against fracking. So when we have the discussion period, we can talk about those ideas, and most of them being conceptions of other people, but not necessarily the debaters. The second thing is we're going to make 5-minute speeches. Typically we make 7-minute speeches, but here we'll do 5 minutes. At some points you're going to hear people knocking on the table. That means you like an idea. So if you like something a debater's saying, feel free to knock on the table in agreement. At other points you'll see maybe Dave stand up and ask a question. So that's called a POI, and he's allowed to ask us anything that he wants, and we should probably respond to that. So does anyone have any general questions? That's just the quick gist of what we'll be doing here. Anything to add, debaters who are here? Zach, Nelson, anything? Yes.
So what's the setup of how you guys are gonna present your arguments and then defend and
Okay, so this motion is this House would oppose hydraulic fracking, which means that Dave is going to go up first and talk about how he opposes this, and then I'm going to get up and talk about all of the good things about fracking and why I don't oppose it. And then it'll go back to Dave's team, and then it'll go back to my team. So it's kind of like one side presents, next side that doesn't agree, and it goes like that. In a debate, it goes through 8 people, but here we're going to just do 4. Does anyone have any more questions or concerns? Cool. Yep.
whenever you're ready?
So, as you heard in that wonderful video that we saw in the intro, fracking is becoming a huge debate. Fracking is becoming a problem because we have reached a point in our society where our traditional methods of oil extraction are no longer fulfilling our need for oil, and no longer fulfilling our need for oil in a cheap way. So we're turning to other alternatives. We're turning to alternatives that are growing more and more extreme. And insofar as we are turning to these more and more extreme answers, we are developing more and more problems insofar as it affects our environment and insofar as it affects our society. And we are coming to you to say that fracking is simply not worth it. Fracking is not worth lowering our oil costs. That the detriment that fracking brings you and the environmental problems it creates are simply not worth those lower costs, and we as a society should deal with that increased oil prices. So at first I would like to say to you, yes, we live in a fossil fuel-based society. And yes, and I think everybody that is going to bring to you today that we can't sustain this in the very long term, that we all need to be turning to renewables. But what we're going to be talking about is how we differ between here and there. I'll take you just 1 second. So what I really want to bring to you is that fracking is a culture, is generating a culture in which we stick to oil and drives us to more and more extremes, delaying our eventual return to renewable energy. But you disagree?
Is it possible that most of the harms that come from fracking are due to negligence of the United States? Because in other countries, they don't have nearly as many errors with their fracking process.
Yes, I would like to point out that she said nearly as many errors. And what we are bringing to you is the fact that by the very nature of fracking, having any errors is too much of a problem. Having any errors is too much of a problem for us to justify its usage. So I would like to expand a little bit like what we are talking about with fracking and some of those very serious damages it brings you. First of all, we have this question of drainage. That fracking itself is a very water-intensive process. A very water-intensive process oftentimes in regions that don't have an excess of water. You have places like Texas and Arkansas, which are some of the biggest fracking regions, but are also experiencing massive droughts. That right now, fracking takes about 2.4 to 7.8 million gallons of water to operate a single well. But these areas, their water table simply can no longer support this. That throughout the United States' history, we have used an estimated 97 billion gallons of water just for fracking. But the problem with fracking is this water isn't always recyclable, as the fracking industry would lead you to believe. Oftentimes, this water, which has now been contaminated by the countless chemicals that was described to you in that video, is recyclable insofar as we can use it for fracking again. But it can never be reintroduced to our water supply. It can never be reintroduced into our irrigation. It can never be used again for the practical purposes we need it for society. And in these places that we are having fracking, we cannot afford to go forward and have these droughts, go forward and have all these problems. And what we are saying to you is that fracking is bringing you all these troubles. And all these troubles that we need as a society need to say, we're going to draw the line, we are going to eat these higher oil prices, and we're going to deal with this because we want a sustainable, we want a sustainable future, and we want a practical future. Because once you start saying, like, I'm going to go to more extremes, I'm going to go to any oil source I need in the meantime while I'm working towards this end, this drives people to more extreme answers. This drives people to not only engage in fracking, but also to engage in oil exploration in more dangerous places. We see this in things like Chinese exploration of oil sources in Africa, and the U.S. government's pressuring of the Mexican government to legalize fracking in its own nation. That Western nations and more industrialized nations, because they can afford it, are simply going to exploit other nations in the meantime, and are going to use their resources to maintain oil no matter what. And that as a society, as a global society, we as a world find this very problematic. That somewhere we need to draw the line where we're not going to go to any means necessary to have oil. We as a society are going to restrict our oil production to what means we have, with the understanding that yes, we will have increased oil prices in the immediate future. Yes, we are going to have to bite that bullet, but we in the long term will not have these detrimental effects. We will not have our groundwater contaminated, and we will not be continuing a very poisonous oil culture. And it's for these reasons we on the government are very proud to propose this motion.
Never enough of a reason to just say, I'm afraid, time to run, right? Because the last time I said that, my mom would have stopped letting me go outside because I fall off my bike and make a lot of errors, right? So that's kind of the rhetoric that we get coming out of him. He's like, well, sometimes people mess up. And we think that that's not a reason to not do something that brings benefits to people, like jobs and like more safety techniques and things like, supply and demand and meeting our long-term sustainability. Because what Dave and I both want is sustainability. But what Dave wants is sustainability that's going to be a lot harder to get to and a lot harder to see an end of. Whereas Ollie and I want a short-term sustainability that we can be reaching now as it affects our lives. So I'm going to talk to you about this in a few things, but I want to bring up the example of Russia, right? Because Russia does fracking now. And this is kind of what I asked about in my POI, where they only have like a handful of instances of contaminated water, what that proves is that the United States isn't necessarily doing something wrong, but they're doing it the wrong way, like by not using properly double-lined pipes to do fracking. And they're doing things like being negligent and careless because they don't feel like taking the proper ways to do it. That's where the people step in and make sure that they do it correctly. So the United States holds about 1,000 trillion cubic metric feet of natural gas, right? They hold this much natural gas for us to tap into, as you saw in the video. We think what that means is the Energy Information Agency said we can use that for our own sustainability now. And if we don't use that, what we're doing is hurting the people. So in what ways, right? The first way is that fracking plays a role in making things cheaper for us in the long run. So this is something they don't want to talk about on their side. But a lot of people can't afford heating their homes in general. A lot of people can't afford certain basic things that other people can. And why is that? Because we have prices that have been driven up. Because we can't meet demands of what our population needs. So at the point where we can meet these demands, where we can meet the demands of natural gas needs, and we don't have to continue burning coal, which is directly contributing to the greenhouse gases right now, we think that the United States ought to do that. And the United States ought to help its people when and where they can. So how else does this happen, right? Because a lot of jobs are created, and he doesn't talk about this. A lot of people are created in involving this, companies, jobs right on the lines where this actually happens. So it does three things. First, it brings jobs into town. As a result, it brings people into towns, and therefore brings new business. And we think that when our economy is as fragile as it is, you cannot just merely factor in the environment, as hard as that is to hear. Because when you do that, what you also do is shut out people who are directly affected by the economy in itself. And we're not telling you to ignore all of the harms that it gives to the environment. But what me and Alia believe is that what you should do is look at negligence, and look at bad practices, and look at better ways to do things that do harm the environment, but also help our people in the long run. So what else does this do for us, right? It's an alternative for our companies and for our countries to not be dependent on foreign oil. And we think that this is kind of important, especially if I tie environmental related issues directly to the issues of the economy. Because what we do now, if we can't do it on our own, is rely on other people to do it for us. And what Dave is concerned about is like negligence and practice like that. If we get oil from other people, we can't even control how they're harming their environment. So it's quite possible that if we don't know how someone else is getting natural gas or how someone else is providing for us, we don't even know what environment we're harming at that point. We don't even know who we're harming where. And we think that that's even more harmful than you directly seeing the results of what you're getting within your own country and being able to fix those results. I'll take a question at any time, my loves. So I think ultimately what we need to look at here is that we have a lot of problems to solve. 1 second, Dave. We have supply and demand that we need to meet. We have job creation, and we also have an accessibility to an alternative. Go ahead.
So while you're creating maybe 500 jobs in a local community now, aren't you now making that community dependent on an unsustainable economy?
Here's the thing. If we're going to battle back and forth over who's unsustainable, we both have some degree of unsustainability on our side. But also, play it fair when you say we're only creating 500 jobs in one community, because it's various communities that this happens in. So let's up the stakes a little bit. What we don't do is make them dependent on this one thing. Why? Because it's going to be happening in the United States primarily, firstly. But secondly, we think that when it brings in new business and new people, that doesn't automatically mean we only bring in one ideal of how economies should be structured. So yes, this is the first thing, but the flip side to Dave's question is, some economies that are broken now would take this opportunity to have that be the one thing. Like, I would definitely take that over being in poverty and being unemployed. So that's the downside. And if they're dependent over the long term on this unsustainable resource, we're gonna have another debate on a new avenue and a new way to get them no longer dependent. But we don't think that's a harm on our side to the point where we're giving them something to start with in the short term. So we think that what this does ultimately, and what is really a benefit on Alia and I's side, is that the prices are being driven down. And we think that that connects to everything. But what you have to weigh here is whether or not you believe that it's fundamentally harmful to the environment in a way that we can't change our practices, in a way that we can't limit our practices. But I think that deleting fracking, when it connects so many people within an economy, is just as unwise as Dave is bringing to you with us having it there. If it's just an issue of how we do something, we think that we should do it differently. Thanks.
Always correct. Or it may not always be correct, but it's never the wrong place.
Sorry? 4 minutes is not the words.
So 4 minutes, not
So a lot of what Logan brought to you today was about kind of cowardly running away from the idea of, yeah, there's some error there. If you're doing it improperly, there are these negative effects. But we're not really buying that because this idea of the short-time solution for an economic boom, one, we believe that you should be putting other forms of job creation that are healthier into the economy, not ones that have devastating effects, both long-term and immediately. And so there's not just chemical contamination that's the issue with environmental effects. I'm going to go in a little bit about what exactly are the environmental effects that so devastatingly hurt these communities and why it's not worth it to have this kind of temporary job solution when there are people that will be suffering drastically from this. And two, why we need to draw a line somewhere, right? And we don't want this kind of cascading effect of putting more and more technology, more and more energy and effort into these negative consequential environmental harms for producing energy. Because we think then that, okay, now fracking is a cheap way to effectively boost the economy. That'll lead to what's next? Maybe tar sands. And yes, let's go and exploit into third world countries because that's our cheapest solution that will help citizens in this way. So we're not really buying that you can really say that justify fracking just because at the moment it can seem like a cheap, sexy way to provide energy and provide jobs for people. But first, let's go a little bit into what exactly fracking is and why it's so damaging and why it's not okay for jobs because of these harms. So throughout fracking, there's a lot of water use, right? There's an acid stage, pad stage, and a prop seepage stage. And in each of these stages, lots of gallons of water used. And by lots, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands in each stage. So there's thousands of gallons used in the acid stage where they're mixing these dangerous chemicals in to clear channels, right? And then there's the pad stage where you put slick water solution and hundreds of thousands of gallons are used in this. And then the prop seepage stage in which several hundreds of thousands of gallons are used. In one water well, you can use 2.4 million to 7.8 million gallons of water. And in 2011 alone, 97 billion gallons of water was used, right? So the fact that this water cannot be taken back into the environment effectively, that at best case you can recycle it into fracking is not a good justification because we're losing all of this water. And a lot of times in these places where we are fracking, there's a drought problem. So in Texas and Arkansas and California, you see all these really drastic droughts exacerbated by this extreme depletion of water sources. But first, Alia.
Okay, is it possible that if we close up the loopholes in the Clean Water Act and things like that, we'll be able to regulate all of these harms that you're talking about?
I don't think so, honestly, because it's not about improving so that less water is used when the amounts of water being used are billions and you can see immediate suffering through droughts. We don't think that there's ways to clean up this kind of devastating amounts of water, and we don't think even if you can improve it to its best ability that humans can, that it is going to be in a way that eliminates this drastic harm of water. So first there is this, you're taking away water and most of it's being contaminated so you can't bring it back in. And then on top of that, you're causing problems with, first of all, the amounts of wells, the number of wells used alone, and then the amounts of wells created to store waste from fracking specifically creates environmental issues on its own. That they believe that there is seismic unbalances created from this, and even earthquakes are happening now directly from the impacts of fracking. So we think here that when you see that we are losing so much water, which is causing these drought problems that people are being affected by, that there is this contamination and people are not able to drink their own water, that they can set their water in their homes on fire because of these chemical contaminations. That's a huge issue. And then when earthquakes are being increased, and this is harming people too, and we have to repair for this damage, it is not only costly, but it's dangerous to the lives of people everywhere. We don't think we want this to be developed and further. We don't think this is an okay short-term solution. And we don't think we're really running away from this. We think we're acknowledging the actual realistic harms that are coming from this, right? Because it's not about the idea of, oh, this short-term justification or this short-term means will be ended at a point. We don't see an end to this. We only see a further development into these kind of dangerous uses. We think that we need to try to limit this use and that we should be moving only into renewable energy resources. We think we should be completely avoiding fracking in this way because of the problems with these earthquakes, the water contamination, and the water being completely expunged that we can never again reap the benefits of. And water is such an essential piece for life everywhere. And so we see that this is only going to negatively impact people worldwide. We do not believe that this can be justified through the idea of jobability, and we strongly urge you to oppose. Thank
Alright, thank you everyone for being here. So opposing fracking was made sexy by Matt Damon and Josh Fox and the presentation that we gave you before. And it's always fun to be the environmental student that tries to tell you that no, we shouldn't be opposing fracking. So I'm going to try to do my best to you and try to tell you why. Instead of rather opposing it, we should embrace this technology and try to solve the problems that it presents to us. But first of all, let's try to revise the things that Ella has presented to you and try to show you why on our side we can curb those harms as well. So she talked a lot about the contamination and the byproducts of fracking and all these kind of things. We see that, yes, those things do present a certain harm. Those things are bad. Think about it. A lot of water are being used, right? And a lot of those things cannot be recycled and all those things that she tried to talk to us about. But I also do think that as a society, we spend too much time trying to oppose this technology and try to rally against it rather than spend the time that we did before and try to come up with like filters, just the way we did for smokestacks, for coal factories and all these kind of things. The way we created catalytic converters so that we can fit it in our automobiles so that the emissions are not that bad. We think that on our side, we spend more time spending on trying to fix it, the technological loopholes that allow for these harms to exist, we can still embrace this technology. Now, you're probably asking in your minds right now, why do we want to embrace the technology anyway? Why don't we just get rid of it? Well, we kind of sort of have to live in the reality of our energy dependence, and that's exactly what I'm going to talk to you about today. We think that take a look at everything around you. It is so cold outside, and we're really, really warm inside when we don't really need to be this warm inside, but we like it. Why? Because we're comfortable with it. But we don't think about the energy that is required to supply with us this kind of things, right? Take a look at the lights that are on whenever you walk past classrooms. Some of us don't even live within the vicinity of the campus. We take buses. Some of us take trains from Connecticut to come to class. All of these luxuries and necessities, I hear you. So all of these luxuries and necessities are provided to us by energy, by coal, by gas, and by fracking as well. I'll take you in a minute or two. So all of these energies are provided to us. When you keep taking out all of the paper towels that you're getting from Marillac, how are those produced? Those things don't just pop out of trees. You need energies to produce those things. But we like using that. We like charging our iPods and keep our computer on even though we're not using it. Those things, we still need energy. This is the reality that we need to live in, and we need to understand that to keep going where we're going, and even if we do reduce it, we still need energy to supply those things, and we think fracking provides you with that energy. Why? We don't like coal. It's a lot dirtier. We don't like oil and gas because that's a lot more harmful than this. We think that natural gas provide you with less CO2 emissions as a byproduct, and we kind of like that idea. But Dave, you had a question?
Yes. What you seem to be talking about is conveniences we get from this, and it is exactly these conveniences that we're saying are not worth these environmental harms. That these conveniences are things we should be giving up. We should be having to lower our thermostats 5 degrees to save our environment.
Okay, but also you need to understand that that particular idea is not the same thing that's resonating with everybody around us, right? People are still going to keep spending energy and using things the way they do. We need to live in a reality where people do the things that they do and find a way to provide the cleanest form of energy for that particular type of consumption. We think that what essentially happens is, okay, fine, let's try to agree with them that we don't have fracking anymore. how do we then provide energy to support the rest of our needs? What's going to happen is coal production is going to increase. Oil production is going to increase. You're going to end up having more CO2 emissions because part of what they also want to achieve on their side is lower down greenhouse gases emissions, clean up the water, and have all of these beautiful benefits that they want. You think that you can't have all of those things at the same time. On our side, what we try to provide for you is a better transition and an actual realistic transition into using cleaner energy. We think that all of these things can be achieved on our side. We do absorb the harms that they give you, but like, okay, fine, yes, it does harm water supplies, it does harm all of these things. But we think that when you oppose these things and you don't spend the time that you need to create those fixes, it creates a more harmful aspect on your side. You will end up using more coal because that's what people will end up producing because you need to support the kind of energy consumption, right? We think that on our side, we try to brace the reality of how, as a society, our consumption of energy is increasing, and from our side, we think that we tell you, let's go with fracking, but let's also fix the problems that come with it.
Alright, cool. You guys agree with taking questions?
Sure.
Alright, so now I'll take the time if anybody has any questions you want to ask the debaters themselves or any comments you want to add, feel free.